Howdy historians, how's it going? Welcome to Unit 7, Part 4, The Great Depression and New Deal, the most uplifting of topics. The Great Sadness, the Great Depression, which got its name after the fact, like most things in history do. At the time, it was just another panic. That's what we used to call recessions and depressions were panics, which we'll talk about a little bit here. The Great Depression is just one of the most mind-blowing moments in American history, a depression, a recession like we've never lived through. I know when you guys were really young in 2007, 2008, when the housing market collapsed, we went into a really bad depression then. I was just getting out of college. That was a lot of fun. There were not a lot of jobs out there for a teacher. No one was retiring. But that was a very impactful depression, but wasn't even close to the depression that we faced in 1929, all the way up to the start of World War II in 1941. World War II is really what pulled us out of the Great Depression more than anything. Government policies limited the Great Depression, made it better, but we needed World War II to actually pull us out, which we'll talk about later on in the unit in a little bit when we talk about World War II. But what's honestly remarkable about the Great Depression is that we go through it and we come out on the other side stronger, but also we come out on the other side of it still using all of the systems that we had used beforehand. Our political system is democracy or republic, whichever term you want to use. We continue to be a democratic republic after the Great Depression. We also were using the economic system of capitalism before the Great Depression. We continue to use it afterwards. Now, I make some tweaks to both systems, to our political and our economic systems, but typically when you see things like this, when you see unemployment get up to around 30%, when you see people living in shanty towns, when you see people having to line up for bread and soup kitchens because they literally don't have food at home, that is something where typically you're going to see massive and wholesale changes to political and economic systems. You know, you've been using a monarchy and you switch to a democracy. You've been using democracy and you switch to socialism or communism. You've been using capitalism, you switch to communism. None of that happened, right? Instead, we stayed the course. Now, we did have some socialist tendencies that started to kind of trickle in to our political and economic systems during the Great Depression. We started to see some changes to the way our political and economic systems worked through regulation and things like that. But it's remarkable that we didn't see some type of very large wholesale change here as we look at the before and after of the American landscape in the Great Depression. So what I want to start with are the causes of the Great Depression. There's a lot of them, and they all kind of overlap on one another. And that's going to be something that I'll try to continue to reinforce as we go through it, is that all of these things overlap and reinforce one another. But first, I just want to do a little bit of an introduction here to what's going on in the Great Depression. There we go. Sorry about that. I was flipping screens around a little bit there because I had to make sure I could see my timer for my Screencast-O-Matic. So a little intro here for the Great Depression. Now, we've had lots of panics in the past. All right, and we've talked about a lot of these in class. We had the economic panics of 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893. There was even a little mini panic in 1917, right before the United States was getting ready to, or excuse me, 1919, my bad, right after the United States ended its involvement in World War I ended. So we've seen these in the past: 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, 1919. If you see these things happen about every 20 years, and that's actually a pretty typical symptom of capitalism, is that you see a little depression, recession, panic, whatever you want to call it, every 20 years. Now, typically, these only last a year or so. Only the panics of 1873 and 1893 were long-term, as in they took more than 1 year to get over. Besides that, all of these other, panics that we saw, 1819, 1837, 1857, 1919, it only takes about a year and then we're up and out of it. And that's relatively common. And as we move forward throughout the rest of the year, we'll see more of these smaller depressions that occur. It's very rare that you have these very long-lasting recessions and depressions. The Great Depression, of course, is the longest lasting out of all of them. Now, what's also interesting is that as we're getting ready for the Great Depression, if you look at the stock market in 1928, it was absolutely thriving. It was a bull market. It was charging forward like a bull would charge a target, its prey. In 1928, you could make an investment of $1,000 and expect to have doubled it within 1 year, which is absolutely remarkable, doubling your investment. A really good return, like the last couple of years in the stock market have been really good. You're looking at like maybe an 18 to a 24% return, not a double. All right, so the market was absolutely booming in 1928, but there were a lot of underlying problems. The thing is, no one really quite understood these underlying problems, and this is what we see a lot with economic panics, depressions, recessions, whatever you want to call them. Whenever there's an economic downturn, there's typically something going on in the market that we don't know we need to regulate. Like in 2007, it was the housing market and basically allowing people to buy homes at a value that was too high and then not having enough of a down payment on their mortgage, on their loan. So then when the market collapsed, people couldn't really afford the homes that they had, and the homes that they had were overvalued. There was also some problems with derivatives and futures in the stock market crash of 2007. We won't get into that. But there's always some type of problem, and it's like we just don't quite know what the problem is, or that we need to regulate it until it's too late, and then you learn, right? And then hopefully you fix it and you regulate it so it's not a problem in the future. So we've seen these panics before, but in 1928 the stock market is booming. America's enjoying the roaring 20s, but there's all these underlying problems. Now, the actual crash itself is kind of a two-pronged crash. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, we call this Black Thursday. The market had been kind of up and down in the weeks leading up to the Great Fall. And on Thursday, October 24th, there was a selling frenzy on Wall Street. And this happens every now and then. All of a sudden, people start to lose faith, and they start to sell in large numbers. So the floor of the stock market was wild on Thursday, October 24th. There was this big sell-off. People are losing faith in the economy. They want to sell their stock, and they want to just get money in hand so that way it's safer, whereas stock is a little riskier, right? Because it could go up or down. But a group of bankers kind of fended off the disaster. They came in on Friday. They bought millions of dollars worth of stock, and they kind of stabilized the market, at least for a couple days. But then the real fall, the true crash, the true panic starts on Black Tuesday, October 29th of 1929. This is when the bottom of the market fell out. The Dow Jones had been at an all-time high of 381, and it's going to drop down to 198 in about a month. So what we're really seeing there, I know those numbers can be a little abstract, the stock market is losing about 50% of its value within 1 month after Black Tuesday. All right, so about 50% of the stock market's value is gone within a month after Black Tuesday. I mean, that is wild. A bad day on the market these days is if it loses like 3 to 5% in a day. All right, imagine if all of a sudden we lost 50%. Like right now in 2020, the stock market is around 20,000. Imagine if we got down to 10,000. Right, that would be an insane fallout. The market will bottom out a few years later in 1932. It went from 381 in 1929, and the market bottomed out at 41. So eventually we're going to lose a lot of wealth here. And this is the scary day, right? This is when people just went and, were like crowding Wall Street, just like looking for information, just trying to like figure out what was going on. People, unfortunately, were taking their own lives. People were, freaking out. It was hysteria. It was panic, like we've never seen. It was true panic, and obviously it was headline news. Now, why did this happen? That's what we want to start to look at. Those are the, that's the big question that we want to tackle today. Now, one big problem is that there was a very large uneven distribution of wealth at this time. During the 1920s, wages had not gone up. So there was a lot of profit. There was a lot of corporate profit in the 1920s, but wages had not gone up. So although productivity, output, and profits went up, wages did not. So what we see here is the rich get very rich, but the poor stayed poor. All right, and this is a problem for any economic system. Whenever you use capitalism, there's going to be a concentration of wealth. That is something that is just normal. That is something that you can avoid. However, you want to try to minimize this as much as you can. Now, really the only way to minimize it is by wages going up when profits go up. And there's times when this happens. In the U.S. capitalistic system, there's times when it does not happen. The 1920s was a time when profits were going up, but wages were not. Now, why is this a problem? Okay, so at this time, the top 5% of the richest Americans controlled over 33% of all the income. All right. Today, actually, the concentration of wealth is much worse than that. We actually have about 1% of the population controlling 50% of the wealth today in the United States. So our concentration of wealth is actually much greater today. Okay. But again, that's just kind of a side note. Why is concentration of wealth a problem? This is why. When you have an enormous concentration of wealth, the vast majority of the population does not have enough buying power to sustain the economy. So then the economy becomes dependent on a very small group of people, the rich, investing and spending money. But there's a cap to that, right? There's only so much money you can spend when you are ultra wealthy. When you're the top 5% of the American population in 1929, like there's only so much stock you can buy. There's only so many cars you need. There's only so many homes you need, right? Think about that today. Like we've talked in class a lot about how it's important that like there are good companies in the state of Wisconsin. Like we've talked about the Menards family a lot in class, and that it's good that a lot of the Menards family lives in the state of Wisconsin, because then when they buy a private plane, they have their private plane in Wisconsin and they're like renting airfield space and a hangar in Wisconsin. When they buy their 10 different homes that they have across the state, they're stimulating the economy in Wisconsin. When they buy their 20 different cars, they're buying them in Wisconsin. They're stimulating the economy in Wisconsin. Well, okay, so let's say maybe the Menards family has like 2 private planes, 10 houses, and 25 cars, right? Okay, that's really impressive for one family. But that's only one family, right? What you would want to have is some families like the Menards that can, go crazy like that and flex on Instagram. But what you really want is you want the vast majority of families in Wisconsin being able to buy their own home, furnish their home, update their home, have 2 cars, invest in the stock market, buy clothing for their kids, buy groceries, right? You want lots of people spending lots of money. And when there's an uneven distribution of wealth and a large concentration of wealth, that's a major problem, because then you don't have enough people buying stuff. You don't have people stimulating the economy. So then you're making all this money, and it throws everything off when you have this concentration of wealth, because then again, people don't have enough buying power. And then it also looks like the economy is doing really well, so then companies make lots of stuff, right? So if it looks like the economy is thriving and you're Ford Motor Company, you're going to... Hi, buddy. Here, come here. Come here. Say...
Hi, guys.
Good. Say hi, girls.
Hi, guys.
How you doing today?
How are you doing today?
What are you watching with Mama?
Edison.
Oh, all right. He's watching Paw Patrol. So, when the... when the economy's thriving, right, it looks really good. Okay, you're Ford Motor Company, and you're seeing that there are record profits, there's record productivity. You're going to make a lot of cars because you think, hey, there's all this money in the American system. We're going to make a ton of cars because if there's this much money out there, people can afford them. But what you don't realize is that because wages haven't gone up, it looks like there's a lot of money in the system, but there's not. So then people can't buy those cars. So then what eventually happens is you have overproduction, which we'll talk about in a minute, and underconsumption. And then all of a sudden you realize that you made too much of something and you're never going to be able to get that money back that you put into the production of those materials or goods, whatever you made, right? That's why distribution of wealth is a problem. It's an economic problem. I think a lot of times today, if you just bring up the phrase like uneven distribution of wealth or concentration of wealth, people see it as like a political thing, that like, oh, this guy's some socialist going to talk about how capitalism is bad. No, capitalists will tell you, economists will tell you that concentration of wealth is bad for the economy as a whole, right? Because it's not just a social thing, all right? If you want to talk about the social religious side of concentration of wealth and how it's a problem, here you go. You can pause it and look at these, this quote from Pope Francis and the problems that he sees with trickle-down economics and cap. But I think this chart gives us a good understanding of the problem here, okay? So when you have a really severe concentration of wealth, the vast majority of your country just doesn't have enough buying power, right? So I'm more of a visual guy, so this is easy to see, all right? You can just see how land ownership and land mass would be divided based on the concentration of wealth we have today. So you've got the top 1% with about 50%, top 9% with almost, with a huge percent of it, all right, 30, 20, 40 when you go by population. All right, you want a more even distribution so more people can buy things. Okay, go over to the next part of the